Well, welcome everybody to the May Language Teachers Forum with Kelly Shoecraft speaking about translanguaging pedagogy in action. And just before Kelly starts, I'd like to welcome Kieran Greenhow from Get Educational Tours, who's going to spend a couple of minutes to tell you about what his company can offer. So thanks for joining the Language Teachers Forum. It's a joint initiative between Griffith University and the MLTAQ. And I'm Lee Kerwin, a lecturer in Japanese at Griffith and president of the Gold Coast branch of the MLTAQ. So thank you, Kieran.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Lee, for this opportunity to address the members of the MLTAQ. I'm from GET Educational Tours, and I'm the Queensland and New South Wales Business Development Manager / Account Manager for the company. You may be familiar with our company and travelled with us in the past. We've been in business since 1960, originally set up there in Melbourne, and our sole business is school group travel. Now, for the past 2 years, we haven't been too busy. Obviously, there's been no international travel, and our only revenue really has been domestic travel. It's great news now that Australia, now post-pandemic stages, we're open, and more destinations overseas are opening up with fewer restrictions on travel as well. So we have different itineraries such for tours, being language, civics, history, STEM, music and performing arts, and that all ties back to the Australian curriculum. Pre-pandemic, we had over 12,000 students travelling with us annually. We hope to get back and beyond that from next year. The next one. Okay, so for our language study tours, which is most appropriate to everyone this evening, our most popular is New Caledonia, in France, Japan, Germany, Italy, Spain, Indonesia, China and Malaysia. So we have programs in all of these countries. You can view them on our website, but also all of our itineraries are flexible, or we can create an itinerary that you may have done previously and you'd like us to quote it. You can just provide me with that itinerary and we can quote a totally independent, something other than our website, but you'll find on our website lots of different ideas and programs that we already have existing. We do intensive language lessons, we have homestay, culture exchange, of course we put in sightseeing, visiting local schools for the students to get some exchange there, language immersion, then we have workshops, activities, cooking lessons, music performances and cultural experiences. Yep, so on the last slide there's just our contact details, so our 1300 number from anywhere in Australia, you can call us on that. We have our email and the website. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn, so we have pages on both of those. And you'll see down the bottom, CETO, Student Education and Travel Organisation. GET is a founding member of this organisation. It's a peak body for student educational tours. And we recognise that there was a need for insurance that suits travel school groups that covers COVID. And we've only just recently received all that information from the insurer, Lockton Insurance Company, and this will help alleviate a lot of concerns that schools will have moving forward regarding lockdowns, regarding COVID issues. So please reach out to me. I'll be able to provide you a PDS and a handbook on that new insurance, which will go a long way to getting schools confident to be able to travel back overseas again. Thank you so much. I didn't mean to go so long over time. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or email, anything you like. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Kieran. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kelly Shoecraft from the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science at Griffith University. Kelly has spent some time in France and speaks excellent French and also studied Japanese and speaks good Japanese.
Understanding Japanese.
And we've had lots of interest from the languages community about the talk on translanguaging pedagogy in action today. So thank you very much, Kelly.
Hey, thanks Lee. Hi everyone online and hello everyone who's here in person. I will try to manage the space as best as possible. So as Lee said, my name is Kelly Shoecraft and I work at Griffith University, lecturing in TESOL and Applied Linguistics and the Bachelor of Language and Linguistics courses. So just before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're currently, where we are, people in the room, we're currently on the land of the Yagabul, the Yagra and the Turrbal people. And we can say Gurumba Bigi to say g'day in the Yagra language. So I actually live on Yagra land as well. So as part of my interest in languages, I'm really interested in learning some of the local Indigenous languages as well. So I just want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and just remember that these lands have always been lands of language and learning and teaching and study. So I just want to start with a really quick question. So people in the online space, if you can type in the chat for me, and anyone here wants to talk, I just would like to know what languages that you actually speak or teach, as the case may be. Does anyone? Yes?
Chinese and Japanese.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Do you want to?
Good English, bad English. I play with Indonesian, I play with Italian.
Fantastic.
Chuck something at me and play with it.
Yes, wonderful. That's great. Hi.
Problematic.
Oh, really?
Yes, but I don't teach anymore at the moment. Let's just say that at home I speak Dutch.
Okay, excellent. All right. And what are the ones we got online?
We've got Japanese,
French,
Italian,
excellent.
German,
Oh, wonderful.
Japanese, Espanol,
Espanol. Hi, Susanna.
Spanish and French.
Excellent. And what about yourself, Catherine?
Japanese, I dabble in a bit of German, some Espanol myself.
Yes, fantastic. Oh, that's so good. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. So Lee already sort of introduced a little bit about my own languages, but just to give you the 2-minute elevator spiel of my life in terms of languages, I studied Japanese in high school and I did a Japanese program at university in Rockhampton. So shout out to anyone who's online who may have been in the same program as me in Rockhampton. And I became a Japanese teacher in Queensland schools for a couple of years. I then decided to go live in France. So I lived in Paris and I was a nanny and I started learning French. And then I went to live in London for about 4 years, working in schools, keeping up with the French a little bit, not so much the Japanese, but I loved France. France is amazing, so I ended up going back to France to live for 4 years in a place called Bordeaux. Highly recommend it now that the borders are opening. It's a beautiful, beautiful place in the world. And so I did a lot of French. Obviously, while I was there, I worked at an international school, which was bilingual, so it was French and English. And that was there that I was teaching young children and got really excited and interested in how young children use their multiple languages and how they were kind of existing in this English-French environment, having come from other languages as well. And then I moved to Vancouver in Canada, and that's where I did my PhD study in a francophone preschool. And then we decided to come back to Australia because the family, and I have 2 small children, so we moved back to Australia about just before the pandemic actually. And so I was just lamenting the fact that I haven't been on an aeroplane since I came back. After all of that travelling, I'm now very keen to get on an aeroplane and go anywhere really. So that's where I'm at now. So I moved back and started working at Griffith, and that brings me to where I am now. So that's very, very quick journey through my languages. And also I'm currently learning Spanish, but beginning Spanish. And I actually find that I use French more for my Spanish learning than English. So my Spanish teacher is always laughing at me because I'm always confusing my French with using my French knowledge and then in my Spanish classes. And I've dabbled in everything else as well, on travels and things like that. So what I'm talking to you all about this evening is translanguaging. And so this term was first used in the Welsh language in Wales to look at this alternating language between input and output, basically. So the input of like reading something and then sort of transferring that into output in writing in a different language, right? So it's changing between the languages. But then Ophelia Garcia, who's based in New York City, then took that term into what we kind of generally talk about translanguaging like today. And like everything that we talk about, there is a spectrum of, you know, little bit of translanguaging to a wider, you know, very sort of further along the spectrum sort of look at what is translanguaging. So I'll be covering a little bit about that during the session this evening to tell you, you know, what is it. But first of all, let's just go back a little bit, and as languages teachers and language users, I'm sure you're aware of this idea of previously we thought of this separation of languages, right? So we had this view of language as two separate or three or four very separate systems. So this idea that in our brain we have language one, language two, very separate, and there's this idea of interference, okay, and deficit, right? That language two is going to interfere with language one. Okay, and so this idea of code switching as well comes from that kind of approach. So when we talk about translanguaging, sometimes people try to tell us that or say that it's like code switching. It's not exactly, right? Code switching comes from this idea of separate language systems, okay? So then Cummings, who's based in Canada, devised this common underlying proficiency model. So on the left side there, hopefully everyone can see the screens, we have that similar idea of the two separate languages, right? And our proficiency in both. And what Cummings was proposing was that this idea that, you know, whatever we learn in one language, we still know that knowledge in another language, right? Like if I teach you maths and how to do addition, in English, I don't need to teach you again the concept of addition and how to do addition in French, but you just need the words, right, to be able to do that. And so this common underlying proficiency we see on that screen there is across all language knowledge that we have. But there's still this separation of language in the sense of the channels, right, where the language is coming in or coming out. Okay, so there's still separating of language there. So when we come to translanguaging then, and this is my beautiful speech, or my beautiful bubble that I've drawn, I've hand drawn there. Imagine this is your brain. But in our unique linguistic repertoire then, which is what translanguaging assumes about our languages, right? So instead of looking at these separate language systems, we have this one big all-encompassing bubble where everything goes. Right? And so we have grammar, and so grammar from whatever language systems we understand, vocabulary from all of those language systems, pronunciation, the sounds, etc. So they're sort of the key components of language. But then we also have things like meta-language, right? We know, you know, what is a verb, what is a noun, how do we make a sentence, right? All of these things that are happening that we're putting into that linguistic repertoire as well. Language awareness, okay, so recognizing language, knowing about language, the non-verbals, the gestures that are extremely important in communication as well, and are similar sometimes or different across cultures and languages as well. We have cultural knowledge. We have images, symbols, okay, that are either similar again or different across languages or across cultures, okay. Non-traditional forms of sort of education and communication as well, right? Music, dance, storytelling, painting, drawing, all of this knowledge of how we can communicate goes into this one place, right? And then the final one is, and I've made it bigger, is the context. Is that what you're waiting for? Context is obviously really important, right? So so when we're pulling from this unique linguistic repertoire, so each of us has one repertoire, right? And the repertoire means that we have multiple sources or tools that we're drawing from in this repertoire, right? To use in a particular context, at a particular moment, with particular people, for a particular reason, right? And so all of that knowledge comes together from this repertoire that everyone has that is unique to each of us because we've had different contact with languages, right? Different experiences, different motivations, different educational contexts that we've maybe learnt in. And so this whole unique linguistic repertoire is this underpinning idea of translanguaging, right? In that we're not separating everything. We just know all this stuff. And so when we want to talk and communicate, we just draw on what we've got to be able to communicate based on the knowledge we have, or whether it's around meta-language, around the contextual factors, or around, what do we actually know? What grammar do we know that we can draw upon in this particular scenario? Okay, does that make sense so far? Anyone online want to jump in with emojis or anything? Go for it. And let me know if you're following along. So the way that we draw from this unique linguistic repertoire is very fluidly, very flexibly, it's really creative, and with agency. Okay, we have choices, right? We make conscious choices. Sometimes we lack, maybe, right, a particular grammar, so we draw on the other resources that we have to try to figure out a way to communicate, right, in that scenario. But sometimes we actually make conscious choices to perhaps exclude somebody or include somebody, or follow rules, right? If it's like, okay, this room, we're in an English-speaking classroom, let's speak English, right? I choose or not to use English resources, right, that I have in my repertoire, okay? So, I'm going to do a little activity with you now. Sorry, one activity only. This is it. You had to tell me your languages and now you've got to do a little bit of one activity. So if you have a piece of paper with you handy, people at home, just grab a paper somewhere to draw. And what I want you to do you everyone have some paper? Would you like some?
Thank you.
What I'd like you to draw is think about where are you going on your next holiday. You can tell my theme. Where are you going to go, or where do you want to go? And do you want a pen? This age of technology, we don't need anything. So what I want you to draw is where are you going to go on your next holiday? So we're just going to do 2 minutes. I'm not going to judge you on your drawing ability. Everyone worries about that. Drawing only. Drawing only. Where are you going on your next holiday? Whether that be a planned holiday or in your dreams. Drawing only. So just 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to give you just 30 seconds now to draw only why that's where you want to go.
Do we add to the picture? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
It's designed to be a little bit challenging, it's okay.
So it's drawing a blank. Literally.
Actually sums it up pretty well. I was going to say Antarctica because it's very lonely and empty there.
Yep, and the white ice or something. Okay, so I can't see the chat. Okay, I think everyone's okay in the chat. All right, so now that you've done that, what I want you to do is whether if you're at home, you can either type it in the chat or just talk to the air or your cat next to you, whatever. But just now tell someone near you where it is that you're going in English. So use English to tell somebody where it is you want to go and why.
Antarctica.
Oh, okay. That was easy. Oh, okay.
Wow.
I did. Oh, we're not supposed to show the picture.
You can show the picture, that's
I
okay.
asked so many questions. Paris, I have been there, but I had a really beautiful experience with my husband, now husband. So.
I can't see.
What?
Oh, that's the why. So, yeah. And I enjoy the escargot there. So I drew a snail and 2 hearts.
Lovely.
I'm thinking a nice.
Oh, Switzerland would be lovely, especially this family there.
This weather.
Yeah, probably go with mum.
In Indonesia. Thanks, Beverly. Thanks, Natalie, for sharing. Oh, beachside for Miho.
Relaxation.
The hinterland. Fantastic.
Garlic sauce.
Oh, New York for a wedding. That sounds divine. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for indulging me there. So I did have a bit of my slide there telling your partner. So what do you think the point of that activity was? Thinking about everything I've just said about translanguaging and this, resources that we have. Any ideas from anyone online or in person?
Translating a drawing into words.
Yeah, that's part of it. Absolutely. Yep.
Multiple strategies to access different ways of
Big voices for the online.
Big voice.
multiple, like a different strategy, but ultimately representing multiple strategies to access information and convey it in various ways.
Yep. So the possibility to be conveying information in different ways. Yeah. How much easier it is to communicate verbally. Yes. Yeah, definitely. Words into pictures, transferring ideas. Yeah, great. Okay, so on top of those sort of ideas and things, a little bit summarising maybe, is potentially the frustration, especially the why question. The looks that I got in the room here were like, how do I draw a why, right?
So that's just more how do I draw?
Yeah, okay, yes, exactly. So what happens if you're forced to use a resource, right? In this case it was drawing, but it could be linguistic, like verbal linguistic, right? If I said to you, okay, everyone here, I'm going to judge your teaching capabilities, but we're going to do it in Irish, right? And so the judgment is going to be on your ability to speak Irish as opposed to your actual teaching ability, right? So this frustration of being able to express ourselves effectively when we're very limited in all of those resources that I have in that bubble that I showed you, and yet I'm saying to you, no, you can only draw, okay? And sometimes that could be easy in things that are concrete, for example, with the drawing. Other times it might be more challenging, right? So that's one reason. So that frustration that, maybe some of our students are feeling as well. The fact that you were told to just draw, were you thinking with any other resources while you were drawing? How were you thinking while you were drawing there?
Imagery.
Okay, so you were thinking in images? Yep.
But also obviously with words.
Yep. Yeah. So your sort of inner voice, like thinking with words. So were they English words?
Combination, because my particular destination was a little bit linked to
yes,
language.
So it was, So maybe there were some Japanese words in there as well. Okay, yeah, right. So so please.
Also representation. So thinking about like sort of what a heart means to me as opposed to what a heart means to somebody
yes.
else. So,
yeah, absolutely.
It's, a form of communication.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's right. Because when you drew the hearts, I actually was like, oh, you love Paris, right? You love France, but it was to do with your relationship of love, right? Yeah. So absolutely. That's a really good point. Yeah. Right. So, and then the comments, so symbols. Yeah, so someone was thinking sounds. That's super interesting. Okay, things that relate to each other. Okay, yep, trying to be a bit creative maybe with, okay, how can I draw this with my limited drawing ability, right? As well, absolutely. And so the other thing that comes from that activity that I like to point out is that even though you drew it with only drawing, you were then able to use that drawing to speak in English, right? So you weren't limited in your then transferability, as somebody did mention, around, changing or using different resources then to talk about it, right? So that's going to be some key parts about this sort of translanguaging that I'm talking about throughout this, the rest of our session together. So we can think about it in terms of our bilingual continuum, right? So as learners, when we're first learning a new language, so if we're monolingual to begin with, we start learning a new language, we start at this sort of end of this a monolingual person, but also monolingual mode if I'm choosing to only be using one resource, right, one language. But then we can move along and back and forth between this bilingual continuum, right, in terms of who we're talking to and these kinds of activities that we might be doing that involve multiple, I can go back now, multiple languages, right? So whether that be bilingual or multilingual as well on our continuum, okay? And so for me personally, when as Lee so nicely put, my French is fantastic apparently. I mean, I don't know if it's that good, but with speaking how to speak French with people who are also bilingual French-English, we just use whatever. We don't care which language we're talking in. It's whatever comes out in the moment, right? And so that's full bilingual mode on this continuum. Okay, I love this. Just have a quick read. I might read it out as well. Do you know how frustrating it is to have to translate everything in my head before I say it? To have people laugh in my face because I'm struggling to find the words. You should try talking in my shoes for 1 mile. I actually love that. I'm going to use that forevermore. And then obviously trying to correct the person and what they're saying there and saying, no, I know what I meant to mean. Do you know how smart I am in Spanish? So if we have students who are not proficient at the language we're forcing them to speak in, all of that knowledge that they have in that underlying proficiency cannot be expressed. And so that frustration, right, that anxiety, that feelings of maybe exclusion, okay, so all of those things come into play. Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm just going to show you a couple of little things from my PhD study. So I was working with 3 and 4-year-old children. So I was in a Francophone preschool, so the target language was French, okay? All of the children at the school, to be part of the school, needed to have a Francophone parent or grandparent, okay? So someone who had learnt French growing up or spoke French. But even though there was varying French proficiency levels, okay, just to give you a bit of a... And I was in British Columbia, which is English majority, even though there's French speakers there as well. And so when the children were in the classroom and playing, they were using their resources. So remember, coming from that perspective of translanguaging, a unique linguistic repertoire, they were pulling from all of these resources, and they were choosing resources based on their needs, based on the need to play, the want to play, their communication in the classroom, doing tasks. They wanted to get rewards, right? There was a reward for speaking French at this school, right? They got a certificate. Following rules, okay? There was an expectation to practice French as much as possible, but also there was subversion of the rules, right? Anyone that has worked with children or knows children or has children, we're very good at subverting the rules. Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So feel free to talk to me in Indonesian if you wish. But also to practice language, right? So there's all these reasons that I was noticing children choosing particular resources in the classroom. And they were doing it really creatively and really resourcefully, right? They were choosing things that were appropriate. They were combining things. They were switching, you know, if it wasn't working or if they kind of realised they were talking to the teacher, right? They'd swap, right? They'd talk to their friend in English and then the teacher would come to the conversation and they'd switch into French, right? So they were choosing based on all of these different reasons. And so, oops, wrong computer. Oh my God, there's too many computers. No, it's all good. So just a couple of quick snippets because I don't want to go too far into the time. But so this is one example where we have the child Juliet. So these are all pseudonyms, of course. So Juliet, the teacher was talking to her. She was dressed in a zebra outfit, and the teacher asked her in French, you know, where's the zebra going? Is the zebra going to the igloo? And Juliet replied with a nod. Right, she nodded her head. Then the teacher said, well, where is the zebra going? In French, as you can see, où est-ce qu'il va, le zèbre? And then Juliet pointed to the igloo, which was a tent covered in a white sheet, just for contextual factors. So the reason I like this example to start with is that even though Juliet is not speaking any French or any language, like verbal language, she's still showing understanding of French. So she's still exhibiting French competency to a level, right? So she's understood the French. She knows what's being asked for and she's replying in some fashion, right? So she's choosing resources to reply with that are appropriate and that continued the conversation. So here we have Jade and Murray. Murray was very proficient at both English and French, and she very clearly separated her languages in the classroom. And so here we have Jade, who is playing, so it's a pair sort of activity. They're playing with keyboards. There's no teacher around, but Jade is practicing her French and counting in French, right? Un, deux, trois. And then she's like, oh, where's cat? And so here we see this mixing again, right? The translanguaging. So where's cat? And she's pointing as well, so we've got the gestures in there. Murray leans over, and Murray is very, very capable of saying in French, it's there, but she's sticking to this, you know, peer-decided English as their common language and is using English to say it's there, okay? And then they continue going in English. So they're very flexible in their use of their language, right? And they're deliberately choosing language, even though they're capable potentially. And so this example here is Murray again. So this is a longer conversation, but basically a child who went over to the teacher and was dobbing on the children who were in the igloo, because there's only supposed to be 2 of them, but there were in fact 3. So he's gone and had this conversation in French with the teacher telling her about these children and how they're being really naughty in the tent, in the igloo. And so the teacher's gone over and entered into the play, and the teacher's knocked on the door and she's like, il y a quelqu'un? Is there anyone in there? And then no one answers, like they're all being really quiet in this tent. And they're like, no, il y a personne. So she's talking back to this other child who was the dobber. And then she knocks again, and then the girls are like, no. And then she's like, oh, I can hear someone in there. And then she's like, how many friends did we say are allowed to be in the igloo, right? And this is all in French. And the girls replied, deux. So they've replied in unison, 2. But then Marie, who is quite efficient in French, she's actually started negotiating with the teacher in French about the rules of the play. And she's explained in French, but it's 3 animals. We're animals, so that's okay, right?
That's right.
And so, yeah, so it's amazing, right? So she's manipulating not only the play rules, but her language ability, right? Her competency in her language. She's using her language. She's sticking to the rule of speaking French to the teacher, but simultaneously negotiating, well, actually, we're animals, so we're allowed. And so the teacher actually concedes to that, and she goes back and tells this boy that's okay, they're animals. And then invites him to put on some outfits and animal outfits, but he was a bit not impressed and went off and played something else. So it's really interesting how these children were using their linguistic tools. And so the last example I have is this boy, Kieran, and he was a real subverter of the rules as well, and in a really interesting way. So here he is talking with Sophia. They're drawing at a drawing table. And you can see there that they're talking in English and also gestures and communicating through gesture. Then he says regarde, which is French for look. So it's a way that often the children were using French in the classroom. Sophia looks at what he's drawing, goes back to her colouring. Then he's actually finished with his drawing and he goes to put it in his pigeonhole box to take home. And the assistant teacher comes and says to him, what are you doing? Oh, your name's not on it, write your name on it. And so she's saying this to him in French, and she says the expression, écris ton nom, right? Écris ton nom, Kieran. She says it twice. So then Kieran goes back to his group table with Sophia and says the same expression, écris ton nom. So he's repeated it, right? But then he says to her, I'm going to écris ton, but instead of saying your, he changes it then, self-corrects to mon nom. So I'm going to écris mon nom. So again, we're seeing the use of multiple linguistic features. He's effectively using 2 grammatical systems to make a proper sentence, right? Across 2 languages. And then he clarifies on here. But then, even more interestingly, the assistant then comes back again and says, what are you doing in French? And he says in English, now, I'm writing my name on here. So he's capable again of saying, so he spoke to his friend, and usually they're speaking English to each other in French, and then switched to English when he's talking to one of the teachers. So it's really interesting, that flexibility and that way that the children, they're capable. So it's not a matter of the deficit idea of, they don't have enough French to be able to actually use the language, right? They're actually using it playfully, creatively, flexibly for their own purposes, right? So it's really interesting. So these conscious choices, coming back to the idea of context, right? So who are they talking to? What is the purpose? What is the context of the interaction? Thinking about that institutional framework of, we're here to speak French and there's an expectation to speak French. But the social framework that they co-created was much more English with some French thrown in, right? And then the agency, really big one, pushing those boundaries, right? Exerting their identity, exerting that power, right, in the classroom. And so when we reimagine children, right, or just, learners really, as being social actors, okay, then they're using these resources so flexibly. And this was the basis for the work that Ophelia Garcia was doing. She was working with children and seeing that they didn't separate languages like what we were trying to make them do. There was, okay, we're going to learn English today. It's English time, only English only in the classroom. And this whole separation of language, but they weren't doing it. They didn't want to do it, but they didn't need to do it, and they were capable of much more, right? And so this was a sort of springboard then into this whole idea of translanguaging, right? So developing their plurilingual, right, multilingual competencies through the use of multiple resources, right? So then when we talk about translanguaging, so thinking about drawing on all the resources to communicate, make meaning and achieve whatever the task might be. And then what I really like about translanguaging is that all language is seen as a resource. And when like we saw in the children in the examples, when they're mixing or playing with language, it's actually a sign of practice and progress, right? It's like when we make mistakes in language, it means we're trying something new, right? We're trying something that's a bit more complicated, a bit more complex. So we're trying to improve on our language ability. And so it's the same in here, right? If we're mixing resources that we're drawing from our repertoire, it's actually a way of practicing language and playing with it and trying it out, If you're putting a French word into an English sentence, you're at least trying your French word. And then you might put a few more in next time, right? So it's a really nice way to sort of be rethinking, and the last point there, considering and valuing the entire linguistic repertoire of the children or students, right? I'm talking about children in this particular context, but all of our students in that regard. So then when we come to thinking about what is translanguaging pedagogy then, so translanguaging itself is this practice, right? The language practices of the bilingual, of the individuals, right? What is it they're actually doing with their language repertoires? So if we think about translanguaging pedagogy then, it's when we are aware that the children's repertoire exists or composes of things that beyond what our classroom is actually seeing, right? It's beyond my Japanese teaching or beyond whatever it is that I'm teaching in the classroom. And then that, by tapping into that, as the wording on here is, like tapping into that repertoire to help learn whatever the language is that we're trying to teach, right? To be supporting that language learning, to be able to flexibly and actively use the language resources that we have. And so sometimes this can actually be a planned activity, right? In that, you know, we consciously and intentionally say, right, this is going to be a translanguaging activity or a, you know, mixing language activity, like the one I did, you know, with the drawing or something. But it could also be that you're just providing space for students to use whatever languages they want to use or whatever resources they want to be using in that moment, right? It is intentional. We're not going to have a free-for-all of like, do whatever you want all the time and not have to, you know, ever use Japanese. That's not the point, right? The point is that providing that space and remembering that they've got resources and repertoires and all of this knowledge that we can be using in order to kind of continue that learning process, right? And it's always, as is basically what I've just said, it's strategic, right? It's not just random use of translanguaging pedagogy. So why should we do translanguaging pedagogy? Why am I here telling you about all of this, in my opinion? So some of this is my opinion, a lot of it comes from research as well, but I love this. Bilingualism is our superpower. You know, so it's really moving away from that deficit idea and that, you know, that sort of, oh no, you know, where like, especially with the ESL kind of, or EAL environments, right, about that, oh, you've got to speak English and, you know. So this superpower is amazing, right? Language is a resource. We can use what we know about language, we can use how languages are similar, even how they're different can be useful for learning another language, right? By comparing and acknowledging differences can be helping to be learning. So I really like this one. So my children are bilingual, French and English, and I have smatterings of bits of other pieces too. And in my case, it would be French, would be the manipulative language, because I know Mummy likes it when they speak French.
Do you speak to them in Japanese? Sorry.
A little bit. We have some Japanese books at home from my teaching days, and so I read them to them. Yeah, so I can still read some hiragana for the kids' books. So we do read Japanese a little bit as well.
I'm
yes.
Because, sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
I've got two children, and
yes.
knows, but that we're trilingual at home because my husband's Indian.
Oh, fantastic.
So we're doing Hindi a lot,
yes.
more than we should, more than we do Chinese, which I should do more. Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah.
But generally it's English. But, we've got our grandma's living with us from India, so a lot of Hindi going on.
Yes, so the contact with the Hindi, and the children will be noticing that Hindi's a bit more, and the English obviously outside the home. They're noticing what's the kind of language that's more useful at that time. So they will also choose to use more of whichever ones they're thinking are like, this is the one that's going to get me friends, this is the one that's going to get me things from grandma, right? And so they're going to practice whatever it is that they see as beneficial. Absolutely, yeah. No, that's right. So that motivation and finding but even just having the contact with it. And so all of these things around just talking about the language and the differences and things like that with Chinese and everything, yeah. So superpower. Really great way to be seeing our bilingual power, right? Our bilingualism in students. So some other reasons as well, right? So it's using all of that repertoire, all of that knowledge that we have about language, about culture, about, you know, ways of communicating, that we can be using all of that in order to then learn another language, right? An additional language. We can be using language flexibly and then be increasing that bilingual or plurilingual competency, right? Because in the real world, right, outside our classroom space, we're going to interact with different people, right, with different languages, and maybe some of those words that I learnt traveling around the Ukraine will come in handy one day, you know. So just there's this idea of kind kind of preparing ourselves for what is actually a multilingual society, right? Preparing our students. So social justice as well, this is something I'm really interested in as well, is the fact that, especially with minority languages, by providing space for them in a classroom or just in any place where we can translanguage, is actually valuing that language. And by extension, identities and cultures, right? Because that's so, sorry?
Je suis Charlie.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole
Yeah.
thing became a slogan.
Yeah, that's right. And so students who are, again, you know, in these frustrating situations of I have to use this particular language, that then cuts off like their culture, their identity, like everything about the language that is part of them, right? And so providing space, even if it's only part space, like sometimes space, you know, for using that or talking about that language. And so that's part of the reasoning there as well. Home language maintenance, okay? Obviously as well, language revitalisation, so talking about Indigenous languages, right? Again, I see this as a way that we can be bringing Indigenous languages into spaces where they can be used more and revitalised in ways that if we put pressure on, okay, we've got to find a speaker of the language who's fluent and has to use it all the time, and which language do we choose, and all of these questions around the separation of it, it becomes really a big challenge. But if we can be just using it in a translanguaging space, then perhaps we can be bringing in words and starting to revitalise and connect to those cultures and identities as well, right, of people. Emotional well-being, right, of students, children, adults, whoever. So the fact that the frustration, the anxiety, that, you know, the pressure, right, all of those things are not good for well-being, really. And by allowing space for other languages can actually be boosting that emotions, right, and boosting the well-being of students. And then having this holistic view of language development. So like I said in the example where the child was only nodding and pointing, if we only look at their French speaking use, then we're missing out on its entire competency that actually exists, right? It's just not being verbalized in the same ways that we might expect in a test or something, right? So by looking at the language used by the whole language that's used by children, we can be then evaluating more effectively their competencies. And the last one, empowerment, giving them more agency, right? So especially in activities where you might say, okay, in this part of the brainstorming activity, you can use whatever language you want, or whatever pictures you want, or whatever you want to do, just do it, just brainstorm, go. And then they have the power to choose, right, what resources they want to use for that, okay? And then the idea of that underlying proficiency and the fact that it's all in one bubble is that then they can translate it into something that's in the required language for presentation purposes at the end, right, or whatever it is that the task is. All right, so I'm going to show you some examples of translanguaging in action. So this is in New York as well, I believe, and this is talking about one activity that this teacher's done. So she's got students that are from multiple language backgrounds, and she doesn't speak any of their languages, right? But she's teaching them English. So we'll just watch and see.
To get into the, I live
Do
in
chat,
China.
yeah, just mute.
Said they have very much good food, but.
All right, can everyone hear okay online again? So can you see the example of how the languages are being leveraged, right, and being used in the classroom? And is that still? Yep, okay. And so the ways that we can be creative using that, even if the teacher doesn't speak the languages of the children that they're expressing themselves in, right? So I think what's interesting with, I believe the situation with the people here and potentially online as well, that you're teaching students who, and you obviously speak both the languages, right? They're majority English speaking, and then they are learning Japanese or something as well. And so it's possibly a little bit of a different situation in the fact that you're bilingual as well, and also that the English, their home language in that scenario, is a majority language and a highly prestigious language, right? So the use of English is a little bit more acceptable, it seems, from what I've noticed, if I compare across languages classes in schools and like ESL classes. It's quite a different approach to how we can be incorporating language. But I think potentially, and tell me if I'm wrong, that in the classes that you're teaching, though, you might have children who speak other languages as well, that are not English or the target language that you're teaching them. And so, again, this could be something where bringing in those resources from those children and sharing that with the class so that they can all be learning about multiple linguistic resources and languages, right? So just something to be thinking about. So some other... Go away. So some other examples, sorry, I'm struggling with technology tonight. So some other examples. So I teach a sociolinguistics course at Griffith. And in this course we were focusing on context, right? The type of language and the fact that there's not one way to say things, right? And it depends on context in English, right? Because the students that I teach in the TESOL are going to teach people English. And so this example was where I'm saying to them, well, how do you say go away? What are ways expressions to use to say go away? So we had some very polite ones and we had some swearing as well. We had the whole spectrum. They're adults, it's all good. And then what social situation would it be, right? That you would actually be appropriately using that expression. But I also provided space for people to tell me about other languages. And so there was one really interesting example where the person was telling us about, in their language, there was this one expression that if you said it with a particular intonation to your partner, it was like a fighting kind of expression. But if you said it to your friend in a different way, it was real like fun and, easygoing kind of expression. So it was a really interesting conversation around, using the languages to better understand that expression, phrases in terms of social context, and then obviously intonation and things like that as well. So there's lots of ways that we're sort of doing this. So in the TESOL class, in the TESOL courses I teach on, so many times we compare the languages. So I'm talking about a particular way that English functions, and I'm like, but it's different to Italian or Spanish or something else. Things like in like Chinese sounds, right? I've got sound bites that I use, which are the word for. Do you speak Chinese? So the word. Yeah, so in Mandarin, the word for like horse and mum and that, it's like, it sounds almost the same, right? And
it's
so
the same pronunciation with a different tone.
Yes. And so we use that example to learn about what tone is, because tone is not as big of a thing in English, but we need to recognise that our learners learning English may have, tonal understandings from other languages, right? And so we're constantly talking about language and learning other language to learn English, right? Or how to teach English. When I was teaching Japanese way back in the day, teaching hiragana, I distinctly remember she has long hair, right? The images that we were using and how to remember them, right? I still use it when I write in hiragana. I'm like, oh, how do I do that one? It's like, oh yeah, the little stories, exactly. So we're creating ways using English to remember the Japanese, right? And the symbols and that kind of thing. So there's probably so many examples that we think about where this is, happening. So some other ones, I had a class literally last Friday where we were talking, this is a social science class, but we were talking about democracy or lack of in mainland China. And I had two students, one was from South Korea and one was from Taiwan. And they were trying to explain something to me. We were actually talking about democracy in Australia, and they wanted to tell me about democracy in China. And they couldn't quite explain it to me. But because they were sitting next to each other and both speak Mandarin, I said, and they were kind of whispering to each other, I'm like, go, talk amongst yourselves in Mandarin and figure it out. And so they talked to each other, and then they found a way to explain to me the concepts they were trying to tell me about, right? And they were looking it up online and trying to find vocabulary. So it was this whole process of translanguaging in order to share knowledge, right? And that was a really great moment for everyone else to be learning about that particular situation, right? And their experiences in their own countries and things like that. So many ways that we can be thinking about using translanguaging as a superpower, right? As a resource, using language as a resource. So the idea of translanguaging then is to be shifting this question, right, and this perspective that we have. So instead of saying, how do I teach Japanese? How do I teach Spanish to children, adolescents or adults who are speakers of other language? What we can be saying is, how do I engage learners in appropriating the language features that come with that particular target language, right? And then bringing it into their own repertoires. So we're using the repertoire they've already got, and we're slowly bringing in new aspects of this target language that we're using. And then seeing this whole linguistic repertoire at play and how they can be using that flexibly, creatively, and adding to it and just getting bigger and bigger, right? The more languages, the more understandings we have, that little bubble just expands in our minds. So this is from a document that Ophelia Garcia actually worked on as well. But I'll just run this. It's very summarising, I guess, some of the things that I've said already. So the translanguaging space is allowing emergent bilingual and bilingual children to compare and contrast the ways that they use language, right? Building that metalinguistic awareness, using different language practices for different reasons, right? Which extends that bilingual expertise and ability to use both of their languages. It actually can be representative of their home languages, right? And the communities that they live in. And so bringing that into the classroom as well, and valuing that, like I was talking about earlier. Developing this consciousness of multilingual audiences, right? And that negotiation of language practice so that we can be global citizens, right? And actually communicate across languages, even if we don't have exact common language in common, but we can negotiate and figure out a way using all of these things that we know, right? Some of my travel, like I have some amazing travel stories, but there was a couple of occasions where my multiple linguistic skills came into practice. So there was one time where we were in Bulgaria, 3 Australians in Bulgaria, traveling around, and we wanted to go on a tour of these caves, and they didn't have any English tour slots left. So there was a French tour guide. So we went on this tour in French, and I translated for my other friends throughout. That was kind of challenging, but I tried to translate throughout the whole experience. And then in the same country, in Bulgaria as well, we were going to go horse riding. So we'd found this little place in the middle of nowhere in the mountains in Bulgaria. And we were in there, and we arrived, and there was this not a little old lady, but an older lady sitting on a porch, and she was talking to us and trying to talk to us, and we were like, well, we don't speak the same language. And then her friends were there, and so she spoke Bulgarian to them, to the woman who was there, her friend, who she'd gone to university with. The woman was German, so she spoke German to her son, who was also there, and then he spoke English to us because he could speak English. So we had this 4-way translation going on so that we could go horse riding, right, in the middle of Bulgaria. So it was just amazing, like the fact that we just managed to, play around with what do we know. I mean, I didn't know any Ukrainian, Bulgarian, like we went on this tour around Eastern Europe, and there was no English anywhere, right? This is about 10, 12 years ago. There was no English. And so we picked up a bit of Cyrillic here and there. We could I had my little dictionary with about 3 phrases, and then we'd sit down with a menu in 2 different languages, neither of which we knew, and we'd kind of either blindly choose things, or we knew the word for salad, so we'd pick a couple of salads, we knew the word for chicken, and so, you figure it out, right? So it's just really fun to be able to kind of use that to be able to communicate in our world, right? And to be able to then experience is multi.
Replicas of the food in a lovely cabinet.
No, we need that in, yeah. although my partner, he would argue that they all look the same, all the plastic. Is it rice or is it egg or is it? But you're right, that would be helpful. I do have a pointer book. I don't know if people use those anymore, but it basically has different pictures. So it had pictures of all these animals. So you'd go, which meat am I eating? And then you'd have a picture of the beach. Like, is this bus going to the beach? Yeah, that was really helpful as well. Yeah. So playing with our language, right, and using things like flexibly and fluidly can be really useful just for general travel, but just, being in the world as a citizen, right, of a multilingual society. So those ones up to number 4 are very sort of teacher kind of organised, I guess. The teacher sort of is in control of them and bringing them into the classroom in a very intentional way. The last 2 are where we're providing that space, right? So number 5 is saying there that all the language resources are engaged in order to grapple with material that they may or may not understand, right? So if they're, working in groups and they've got something in French that they're not understanding and they talk to each other in other languages to figure out, what is it? And that was your example that I really liked when we had your presentation last year, Catherine. You were showing that the children were doing an activity where they were outside in the outside,
Yes,
and they had to go and figure out the different sentences, I think, or the kanji for the family. I can't remember exactly, but they were talking. That's right, and they were talking in English, but talking about the language, the kanji characters and stuff. It was beautiful, and I'm like, this is translanguaging. This is amazing, right? So they're using, and you're providing that space to be. And you're excited about it. You're not saying, oh no, you've only got to speak in Japanese, you're going to not learn Japanese if you don't talk in Japanese, right? So moving away from that, right, and that idea and seeing the joy and the excitement of children being able to figure it out, you know, by using all of these resources and learn. They're ultimately still learning, right? And so being able to self-regulate, which is that last little point there. And then this idea of like what I've talked about already, the playing, and using all these resources, right? So building metalinguistic awareness, but also that creativity, divergent thinking that's happening in their minds. So expectations in terms of applying translanguaging pedagogy then. So obviously they still need to be exposed to the target language, right? Like we're not just going to, as I said, you know, free for all and not use it at all. So we still need to be exposed to the target language. We still need to encourage use of target language and potentially have sort of moments of negotiated time where it's like, okay, you need to speak the language now. Like we need to practice it. This is what we're doing. But the lead up to it might be something else, or the post discussion might be something else, right? This idea of viewing and seeing students as emerging bilinguals, right, is really important. The idea that they're mixing and playing language with language is positive sign of progress, providing that space for other languages to be used, right? That entire repertoire. And then that intentional use of it, right? Really applying it in there. So if anyone's interested, I have a little Padlet that I've put up here. So this is a QR code if you want to use it on your phones, but I can also, the link is there. I'm not sure if you can, yeah, is that working? Yep. But what I've put on here, so this is just the last little bit. I'll just go, I have about 10,000 tabs open, but I might be able to find my actual, stop sharing for 1 sec. The Padlet, there it is. Okay, so on the Padlet, I've put some other ideas around, you know, what translanguaging might look like. But if you want to share, either adding it to the Padlet, or if you want to type it in the chat, or tell me if you're here in person, any other ideas. So when have you seen, now that I've explained what it is, more so what translanguaging is, have you seen it in your own classroom? Have you seen children, students doing this kind of thing, right? Because they do it without us telling us. We don't need to tell them translanguage. They're going to do it regardless. We're just going to allow them, right? Provide the space. So thinking about when you might have seen it in what kinds of activities or how it's being used, thinking about if you've used it yourself or if other people maybe have used it, or just ideas about how you might want to implement it if you're interested in implementing this kind of pedagogy in the future. So feel free to, so I've put up some ideas there already just to give you some as well. So that's setting clear boundaries, asking questions in the target language, but then they can respond, right, if you're understanding the language that they're responding in, potentially. Comparisons between languages, so things like, I know, you know, with French and English, the adjective and the noun come in different places, right? So is it before or after it? In Japanese, the verb comes at the end, right? So that discussion around where, you know, meta-language. False friends, really interesting one, like the cognates and the false cognates can be really fun to talk about. Any pronunciation differences, translating for each other as well, or even translating for themselves, right? So the bilingual school I worked at in France, children came from like all over the world. So we'd have children coming with two completely different languages and then have to do English and French at school. And often, you know, we'd have children that spoke like two or more children would speak the same language. So we'd just say, oh, can you just translate for them and explain to them what we're doing? Or, you know, so that was really empowering as well, because they could practice their language, but they also then had a, you know, sense of, oh, someone's explaining to me, I'm not feeling left out, I understand what's going on. And then others could be hearing the language as well, you know. So translation practices, multilingual storytelling or video creation. Okay, so just ways of, you know, providing that space, like the books that we saw in the example. maybe if the language isn't something that you know, the child or the student can teach you some of the language, right? And say, oh, how do I say this in this other languages? And we can write them all on the board. Or how do we write, right? The scripts are so different. Is it left to right? Is it up and down? Is it some other way of writing in different languages that we know, right? Listening to a story or reading it in one language and then talking about it in another. Group work, right, where it can be a very open space. And then there's a final product that might be multilingual, but might also be the target language as well. So those are just some ideas that I've put up there as well. Does anyone want to share any, or have questions as well, actually,
Just
if you want to?
reminding me, one of our Japanese lectures with Griffith actually did a research paper 2 or 3 years ago on, I think, a third-year class that were preparing a play, writing a little play that they had to act out.
Yep.
And I don't think the word translanguaging was actually
No,
about
probably not.
at that time, but looking back, that's exactly what it was. And they were looking at, you know, the English or whatever else, or sometimes it was Japanese they used, and say, no, he wouldn't say that, he'd probably say this, or she would say this in this situation, or that's not polite enough, you know, and so they were using translanguaging
Yeah.
for that too.
Excellent. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So
So
one of my,
we do it without realising it's translanguaging. It's just giving it a name. When I first heard of translanguaging, I immediately was like, this light bulb of like, that's exactly what I've been trying to do or talk about, you know? It kind of gave a name to something that's, yeah.
Also, one of my daughters was in year 2 primary school in Tokyo for a year, and she was sat with a half Japanese boy who could speak, you know, who was bilingual, and that was his job, as you were saying, to explain to Gemma what was, you know, what the teacher had said and that sort of thing in the beginning. And she was using a lot of both languages too, so there was a lot of translanguaging.
Yeah.
Going on.
Yep. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, so good. Does anyone have any other examples? Come back. I have my final slide. Oh, it's probably not going to share properly. I tell you, after 2 years of teaching online, you'd think we'd be better at this. So there's my question slide. Any questions, comments, sharing of things?
Okay,
yes,
this
please.
afternoon, so I'm currently teaching Chinese, so my 10th year now, and Chinese is my mother tongue. So at the moment, for year 4, we're just learning about different features of the house. So like, this is my house, it has a kitchen, it has all that kind of stuff. And so they're all writing sentences about parts of the house. And one boy, Jarvis, he said to me, well, why don't we just write one big long sentence with all the parts of the house that it has, and then put comma in between. And I'm like, well, that's a super sentence then. So he obviously used his English understanding of putting commas in, listing, and translanguaging it into Chinese, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So he obviously felt confident enough to be able to sort of to want to share that with everybody.
Yeah.
So that was also really encouraging.
And that's what's really important, right? If you want children to feel comfortable using their other languages, like the students, even the adults, the young adults I was teaching last Friday, they were a bit shocked that I said, talk in Mandarin. They were like, really? We can do that? Like, so the expectation needs to be set, right? You need to be giving a safe space to use multiple languages, because they may have been in situations where they're getting in trouble for using other languages, right? And it's not allowed, and there can be, you know, punished. I've been in schools where there's punishments for using the wrong language at the wrong time. So, so it's really great that he was so comfortable doing that. It's fantastic. Yeah, I'm currently doing some work in a bilingual school, and a French bilingual school, and it's really interesting too. Similarly, some of the students they'll use English grammar but with French words, you know, and so it's a challenge for the teachers to be like, oh, that's, instead of saying, oh, that's completely wrong, it's like, oh, I see what you're doing there. Like, you're pulling these resources, right? You're drawing on what you do know and what you have available to you right now, and figuring it out, and like trying to make a sentence that works, I guess, and trying to, you know, to use the whichever language it is that they're kind of being expected to use at the time.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the same thing too. It takes me back to when we were living in Tokyo. There was a family upstairs where the mother was French, and the I think the father was Japanese, but he wasn't around, so the students had both French and Japanese, and so it was really weird French, and they'd say things like, "Oh, je vais à Goji." I'm going at 5 o'clock, but the je vais would be in French and Goji would be in Japanese, and I was just blown away. And it suited me because I spoke both those languages, but I've never heard them mixed up to that extent.
Fantastic.
I guess that was translation at its best, almost.
And if they're communicating and understanding each other, then that's great, right? It doesn't, no, definitely. So,
Maybe a question about a question. Are there any questions in the chat?
Ah, good question, yes. Not yet. Anyone in the cyberspace want to ask a question or comment or share an example with us?
Feel free to turn your microphone on.
Oh, yes, please, absolutely. Yeah. I recognised a few names earlier. I don't know if they're all still there. Very quiet. I do actually, I think, I didn't put it into the slides, but, is there someone wanting to ask a question? Is that Lester? I can see you talking, but do you have your sound turned down? Maybe?
Oh, maybe. Sorry, hold on. Okay, sorry, Lester. Yes, we can hear you now.
It's just my experience growing up bilingual with English and Portuguese. Like with my sister and I, we would just you just mix up the languages because whatever is easiest comes out first.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's normal bilingual because it's you learn things in one context, just keeps, and it's still all these decades later, we still do it.
Yeah, wonderful. And isn't it true, like sometimes there's a word in a language that just doesn't translate as effectively, like gambatte ne in Japanese for me. I just always want to say that, even when I'm not speaking Japanese. Yeah. So there's, as well, it's like what you said, Lester, about contextual and the meaning behind it and whatever comes out, and just having that flexibility and that freedom to do that, I was talking to just a person who's multilingual herself one time about, not in an academic setting, but just talking about this kind of work, and she was like, "Oh, thank you. I've been wanting to do this forever, and I'm never sort of allowed to use whatever language feels comfortable or whatever language sort of flows and expresses myself the best way, So yeah, she's always been in environments where she kind of was forced to speak one or the other, even though she spoke multiple. Yeah, they're really interesting. Yes, definitely. So there's one example here. Anyone else wants to say anything in there? For those that speak French and English. And so you would understand how that feels. If you're a French speaker, obviously, if you're not, it might be a bit jarring. But as a bilingual French-English speaker, it just kind of flows, and you don't even half the time realise if it's French or English that you're reading. So we're capable of, just mixing it up and understanding it.
It's lucky that they mix so nicely, don't you?
That's true, there's other languages that maybe would be a little bit less. Definitely.
I guess this is translanguage, and it takes me back to my university days, and I had an Italian girlfriend who went to Japan for a year after we graduated, and we would write letters in French, but we'd write them in katakana. We both had studied French and Japanese together, so we did that for like a whole year.
Wow.
Torture.
You have to be able to read Japanese and French.
Exactly. Wow.
It lasted a year. Bravo. Wow.
That's an excellent idea. Secret language.
Sounds like some kind of...
Yeah, it was meant to be a secret language, so nobody was.
And
I think, but it was just a fun thing.
There's a lot of the French sounds would just not work in katakana, would they? Absolutely. But that's something else too that I really that I probably should have put somewhere in my slides, is that sometimes people talk about translanguaging as a gateway into becoming proficient in the language. But translanguaging can be used even when you are fully proficient, right? Or, you know, at a higher level of proficiency in any language. You can still play with it. You can still access, you know. So, for example, if I'm writing, you know, my PhD, I wrote it in English. It was, you know, I did it at Griffith. But my supervisor, one of my supervisors was French. So I was reading all these French journals in French and then putting those ideas into my English, you know, PhD thesis. And similarly, the children's, you know, the work that you saw, like my data, was in 2 languages, right? So I was translating it, I was thinking about it, when I present it, sometimes I use it, I say it in French, sometimes I say it in English, whatever I kind of feel like. So, you know, even when you're proficient at the languages, it doesn't mean that the translanguaging has to stop either, right? There's times when the monolingual, like speak only the French, will be important, but you know, because you're in an environment where you need to speak French. But the idea that, you know, it's only a tool for learning at the beginning levels, I think, is something else that's not accurate either of translanguaging. Yeah.
You can get better puns and better jokes.
Yep.
And you mess it all up.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely. I have a current student at Griffith, and she was raised bilingually, German and English, I think. And very strictly, like one parent would only answer her if she spoke in English, and the other parent would only answer her and respond to her if she spoke in German. So she's very proficient at both. But she says that her humour, and she feels more like herself in her humour when she speaks in English, because she can't be that person when she's speaking German. Even though she's highly proficient at it, the humour doesn't translate well into potentially the culture of German, the language of German, and those sorts of things. So it's really interesting to think about, different aspects of that language use, So do you feel like, as bilinguals, when you're really efficient in a language, what's your identity, right? Like, I feel a little bit French from having lived there. It's like, you know, I know my wines and I know how to have the coffee and, you know, like, so I affiliate myself with, you know, being French. But
if that person with the 2 languages, if the parent that spoke to them in in the language where she feels more humorous was a more humorous person.
Oh, maybe.
I wonder if that.
Potentially. Yeah.
Exchange more humour with that. You know,
that's a good
parent.
question. I might ask her. But also, it could be that the English humour itself, right, is what you align with as well. Yeah.
But surely there'd be German humour. Surely.
Yeah, I was just going to say that until now I never considered, because I learned English when I was 9, and I consider that English my more dominant language. I think in English more than I do in Chinese, but when I speak with a group of Chinese friends, the humour that I use is very different from the English humour. And you can probably see that from the British, or not, different kind of cultural shows that we see. Humour is quite different.
Absolutely.
Like, if I'm talking Japanese with other English speakers, I don't necessarily adopt what I would call Japanesisms. Like, I don't do the constant head bobbing and the affirmations and stuff like that. Whereas if I'm surrounded by native speakers of Japanese, I slide into those cultural norms. And I've noticed that, and it's quite entertaining, because when you've got that mix of native and kind of English speakers,
what do you do?
I know, and it messes with my head, because I'm like, oh, and then I'll see the other English speaker doing the Japanesisms, and I'm like, right, that's what we're doing.
That's so interesting. Yeah,
it's fun.
And
but
so
that comes back to your context. It comes back to those multilingual audiences and how, not to manipulate, but how are you best going to be able to communicate effectively with who you're talking with?
Exactly.
They can't really be separated.
No, absolutely. Yep. And then, as well as the person and those contextual factors of where are we, right? Is it appropriate to speaking in this language now at this time? You know, in this, like, if, you know, we started speaking French together right now, you know, that would be a little bit rude, right? Potentially. Or, you know, but you know what I mean? Like, but then Lee and I were speaking French earlier before anybody else arrived in the room, you know. So same room, same 2 people, but the context, right? Yeah. So really important. Awesome. so someone, so Lester's saying that I'm more energetic and excitable when I'm speaking French and not English. I love it. That's awesome. I wonder why. Do you care to hypothesize as to why? Is it to do with the French language or French like personality? Lester's coming back on. Have we got sound again?
I don't know. I've not thought about it unless it's in. Obviously, I've used French more in a teaching role. So in class, you tend to, I guess, be a bit bigger than you are normally in your own context, in your own language. But I think when I'm overseas and talking with French people, it's possibly much the same. A couple of years ago, I was over there with some Aussie friends who don't speak the language or smattering. We ran across, up some mountain actually, and one of the locals, an older guy, so just chatting to him, and they all remarked on it after, that my normal chat with them was much more subdued than when I don't know why, it's...
I noticed it.
It's
I know exactly
sort of,
what he's
curious.
talking about.
Yeah, so contextually, it's just the way that you sort of are, yeah.
Except mine's flipped.
I say to students, I feel like a different person. If I'm speaking Japanese, I'm very polite. If I'm speaking French, you are a different person. I tell them in the beginning, it's exciting to learn a language because you'll see different parts of yourself, or you'll change. And I think your concept of the world gets wider.
So we talk about identities, right? Like we have multiple identities, and even being a teacher and a mother, and I mean they're identities, right? And the languages we speak then come into that. Super interesting. We need to do a study on like all people's like changing personalities and changing languages. That would be so fun.
Cultures.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask about that. To what extent does that actually have to do with the fact that you're actually making different meanings? I mean, when you looked at your linguistic repertoire, I mean, there's the social cultural, but that actually becomes fairly interesting as a field. How far are you going to push that? I mean, is the fact that, for instance, if you speak Italian or French or Spanish, you actually start moving your hands more than if you are speaking from a certain different other group. To what extent is that actually a deep knowledge of your social cultural? And to what extent do we have difficulty when we're actually talking about two languages on a concept that does not actually exist from one to the other? Example, we're all very familiar with that hygge thing from Danish. Okay, translate it for me, please. There's a few languages in which you can do that. And I can tell you now French or English wouldn't be one of them, but Dutch and German would.
Yes.
And similarly, the way that you actually manipulate the language and you interact with other people has to do with that as well. So where does that whole concept of social cultural actually become, knowledge of the world, an epistemological issue? Just a question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. But I think it's part of it, right? Like the fact that and it comes into that, your understanding, your knowledge. But I think what's really interesting when you talk about untranslatable concepts is that what are we missing out on by being monolingual then? Right? If we don't allow to find out what this word means and try to explain it somehow, or even know that that exists because we're not open to the Dutch language or the Dutch culture or the Dutch anything, then we're missing out on knowing about the world, right? As well. So that's really interesting. But I think that it comes into, and I don't actually know the answer exactly to the question, but I think it's a really good question in that when we're talking about how we change our personalities and that, so we know about all of these different understandings of the world through, and it's actually opening our mind to that. So speaking, there's a quote that's in a video that I've played on plurilingualism, it's in French, but it says something like, the limits of my language is the limits of my world.
Yes.
You've all heard it? Yeah. And so so by only having a monolingual mindset, we're not going to learn about those other epistemologies and the other facets of the world that might actually be beneficial to us. How you then talk about them or communicate with those is obviously, translanguaging provides a space to do that, because if you only talk about the hygge, is that how you pronounce it, hygge? Is that the one from Frozen? Is that the hygge from Frozen? No? Is that comfortable, like being, like, yeah, well, we can't explain it in English. You've already told us we can't explain it.
It's close to that.
It's
but
that.
We'll spend 5 minutes trying to explain it.
Yeah, okay. So, but the fact that, now I've lost my train of thought. So, yeah, so thinking about how do we access that understanding without using two languages, right? So how do I learn about hygge if I don't have the capacity to use both the Dutch and the English to talk about it, right? For me to understand it, who doesn't speak Dutch, and for you to explain it to me, you need to use the word itself and potentially, you know, bring in cultural activity that's outside of my knowledge of, you know, whatever I already know. So if I don't know anything about Dutch culture, Dutch identities, Dutch words, then translanguaging provides a space to be able to do that. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
Now that I'm getting carried away on this.
Okay. That is exciting.
The other thing that intrigued me was your question when we did that first exercise, which I actually seriously think this is probably the best representation of what I was going to put in.
Yeah.
Because you said, okay, what language were you first thinking when you had to do this task? I didn't.
Okay.
When you asked where you're going, I just saw the image.
Yeah, interesting.
I think this might have to do with the fact that when I was a little kid, I grew up with 4 or 5 languages at the same time anyway. So you had to sort of find some shortcuts anyway in doing so. But what is your first language? Whoa. My students had a heyday whenever I told them I don't think in a language.
Yeah.
Right. He doesn't think. That's expected. Sure enough.
Who are you?
But
Yes.
I mean, from the way it's presented, I get the impression that this actually applies to people who I think in languages, but there's quite a few groups of people who actually think in other.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Like, you're a good example of you're just born translanguaging in that regard, right? Like, you don't have that language separation from the birth that we're trying to put people in pigeonholing into with second language, additional language, adding language, you know, that whole concept. You're the complete encapsulation of what translanguage is trying to do, is that there is no separation between those languages, and you've done that from birth, essentially. And so I think that there's absolutely space. It's actually probably the way that I'm having to explain it is not resonating with you, because I'm having to explain it using the terminology we've already got and the concepts we already kind of associate with in terms of additional second language, first language. Whereas the like the far end of translanguaging has no boundaries around. So some of the things I talk about is softening the boundaries, right? But when you look at like full translanguaging approaches, it's very much like there is no languages, it's just language, and you're pulling features of language that correspond with your context. And in your case, that's exactly what you do, right? You just pull whatever, you have an image, or you have, you know, at the moment you're pulling English words and grammars to communicate with us in here, but you may be, you know, there's other things going on in your brain as well, right, that you're drawing upon in other scenarios or whatever it is. And so it's not about, oh, I'm going to speak English now. It's about, oh, I'm going to pull whatever resources I've got that are appropriate for this situation. And so it's hard, though, for people to wrap their head around that idea, which is why, and I'm still myself kind of, that's really cool, but how do you talk about it? Do you know what I mean? How do you articulate that? And how do I analyze like my data that I showed you without saying, how cool is this? They're using English and French, without saying they're using English and French. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. Does that answer the question? I don't know if that was your question exactly, but yeah.
But if this is a kind of conversation that's going on with people who have other languages and cultures as part of their repertoire, their backgrounds, can you imagine how difficult this conversation would be with a monolingual who has zero reference points for anything else?
Exactly.
And this is where I think some of that clash occurs, particularly when we're in schools. You know, we're happy to let our kids use any language they like because we're not threatened by it. We don't care if we don't understand it. We know they're not talking about us. They have things to talk about other than us. Whereas there is sometimes that perception from that monolingual mindset of, well, if you're talking another language, you're excluding me and that's rude, always, no exception. And of course, if you're doing that, you must be talking about me, or you're off task and talking about the weekend or something like that. Whereas It's not like that at all.
No, absolutely. Yeah,
So
and that's the
it's a
shame
struggle.
and the mindset, of a lot of classroom environments. Yeah,
Leadership
definitely.
environments even.
Yep.
To try and get it through that. To
Yes.
Get to
Exactly.
where the work actually happens.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Why can't we be doing Japanese, learning Japanese words in their history lessons, even if the history teacher doesn't know Japanese? I've had this conversation before. I don't know if anyone's online. There's just one more. Okay. So Anna online was just saying something similar, I think, about being raised bilingually, Portuguese, French, with translanguaging being completely discouraged.
That's sad.
And I don't believe I have an L1, which is what you were saying as well, right? That I don't have a first language. I just have this language that I have, which I think is beautiful. I think it's really lovely to have multiple, but not being allowed to mix them and play with them potentially.
Between translational, what's the word I'm looking for? Transactional language and target language.
Mm-hmm.
You're obviously working from a majority group for which the transactional language is being used, but the aim is to move towards the target language.
Yep.
But it can be too bad if you're sitting in a multicultural group where you've got 5 of them at the same time.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is, we learn target languages, this idea of being native-like in our target language is a bit of a, I don't know, is it necessary? Like we need to have a language ability that we need. We learn language based on our immediate needs and our functionality and our goals, right? What we want to do with the language. So, and I'm still learning English, right? Like, we never stop learning. So, yeah. Sorry, il est 6 heures, il faut finir? D'accord. Bon, thank you, merci beaucoup, arigatou gozaimasu. Everything else. Thank you, everybody. Merci.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That elicited lots of response, and I guess things that we didn't really know the word translanguaging a while ago, and so it's really interesting to look back and it's a thing.
Yeah. But any questions? Sorry, I meant to say, feel free to email me or through Lee as well. I'm happy to share other resources that I've got around translanguaging, or answer questions or talk or whatever. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about this topic, just language. And we can talk in any language you want. Thanks everybody.
To everyone who joined.